thank you to all of you for joining today. In the meeting, we are also going to post a link for you to join the center's mailing list to be notified of future meetings. So once again, welcome everyone, and Zaid, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ahmed, for the generous introduction, and greetings to all of you. Thank you all for being here despite social distance. Because of social distancing, so many of you are here, and I'm very honored for the opportunity. Thank you first to I just wanted to thank Aishanu doing all the behind the scenes work to make this happen at the center, and Peter and Ahmed for the invitation and for moderating. So thank you very much. I've never done a virtual talk like this before, so it'll be a good experience. Just wanted to kind of mention that so what I'm presenting is a work in progress. I have ideas I've been kind of developing in different ways that are part of the book, but kind of in some ways a parallel argument. And I look forward to kind of hearing all of your feedback. So I wanted to start my talk with a brief anecdote from my ethnographic work, which was from 2014 to 2016. And I believe this anecdote represents the deep, irresolvable tensions and ambiguities and dilemmas at the heart of hegemonic domination. And in particular, how this situation frames approaches to internal critique and reform, and the debates that happen about that in American Muslim communities. So I'll just start with that story. Wait, what do you mean? How can you say that? That's not what Islam says. There was tension in the room. It was a small classroom surrounding Zainab's comments. There was about 10 to 13 attendees, a few undergraduates, mostly graduate students from different universities in the Boston area, as well as some young professionals. And this evening gathering was at one of the local colleges. It was a bi-weekly gathering, a discussion circle named after the first words revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, Iqra, meaning read. The discussion circle was characterized by many as a space in which intellectually open-ended discussion could happen among attendees, rather than being a kind of top-down space in which an authority figure kind of just preaches at people or lectures. And so it attracted a pretty ideologically diverse group of attendees with different people who came in and out of the space regularly. And Zainab, who I began with, was a somewhat regular attendee. She found the Iqra circle to be one of the few communal spaces where she felt comfortable discussing her views of Islam and kind of issues in the community, because she felt kind of alienated from more quote mainstream spaces like mosques and other organizations. And there were many things that frustrated her in our conversations about these mosque communities, but nothing more than the discourses and practices around gender in the community. So the discussion that evening was about the place of women in Islam, and several people in the group responded to popular misconceptions about Islam as patriarchal and sexist. So they presented common kind of communal constructions of complementary and balanced gender roles that correspond with men and women's natures. And they also emphasized the way that Islam had always honored and empowered women. So responding to these views, Zainab challenged the claims being made by appealing to history. She had recently begun to do this wasn't her field, but she'd begun to do much more reading into Islamic intellectual traditions and histories. And in this case, she had been encouraged by a number of people in the community to read the works of one of the most celebrated religious scholars in Islamic history and Sunni intellectual history, the 11th century polymath al-Ghazali. And so she told the group that she had read his short book, The Alchemy of Happiness, which is available online in translation. And instead of, what she was promised, finding deep wisdom and illumination, she discovered several horribly sexist, as she put it, and misogynistic things he has to say about women. So she brought this up forcefully in the discussion and argued that historical understandings of Islam didn't add up often to this rosy, romanticized picture that others in the group were advancing. And, basically saying that we have to confront that. And so the rest of the group, of course, balked and, argued with this kind of presentation, with this perspective of hers. And so after the discussion ended, people chatted as they prepared to leave. And one of the attendees came to greet Zainab. And they maybe met once or twice, but they didn't really know each other. And so the young woman said, "Assalamu alaikum," and then in a tight, polite voice, she said, "You kind of sound like the Orientalists in the things that you say." And somehow she made it sound like a pretty innocent observation, but it was obvious that it was a criticism and an insult. Of course, Zaid's seminal critique has been thoroughly absorbed in American Muslim communities at a certain level, and the term Orientalist tends to be understood as any perspective that spreads bias, inaccurate, racist, imperializing, othering perceptions of Islam. And so the implications, as I'm sure you're aware, of her comment to Zainab were quite clear. So I want to just let you sit with that story for now, and maybe we'll come back to it later. But I want to use that to start talking about the broader kind of point of my talk. So the book I'm currently working on examines how concerns with a quote-unquote crisis of faith have increasingly taken center stage in American Muslim public discourse over the course of the 21st century. And this involves the kind of anxious sense that more and more Muslims are losing conviction and certainty in Islam, severe doubts about the religion, or rejecting essential tenets of faith, or even relinquishing their Muslim identity altogether. And from the years leading up to my dissertation work in the early 2010s through the end of the decade, as I work, I've been working increasingly on this book, it seemed that prominent Sunni preachers couldn't stop talking about this problem of doubt in both local community institutions around the country and in platforms geared towards more national or even international audiences. There's been a wide array of authority figures, public intellectuals, and teachers who have addressed this issue through lectures, sermons, online essays and articles, question and answer forums, educational programs, and so on. And towards the end of my field work in 2016, this trend that I had been following culminated in the launching of the most expansive and well-funded initiative to date addressing this concern. And this was the Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research, which is a new online platform founded and spearheaded by Omar Suleiman, a Dallas-based preacher who has become one of the most prominent religious leaders in the American Muslim community. So yaqeen is the Arabic word in the Quran and in the Quran for certainty. The name of the institute itself thus identifies the goal of the institute, to promote firm conviction, certainty, and confidence about the truth of Islam in the hearts and minds of Muslims. The institute has been very impressively funded, very productive, and in the resources it has published, quite extensive in its reach and publicity. And so as the most significant initiative dedicated to addressing this crisis of faith, the Yaqeen Institute for me really exemplifies the extensive efforts that have been going into addressing this concern, and especially the kind of increasingly formal, institutionalized ways in which communal authorities are responding to this problem. And what I want to focus on for today is that the way in which the problem that the Yaqeen Institute seeks to address is framed within the context of the pervasive Islamophobia that we all live with. This is best illustrated, I think, in the very initial promotional video that was disseminated when Omar Suleiman first announced the launching of the Institute in 2016. And he posted this video on his social media, and it was kind of disseminated around. So I just want to watch the first couple minutes of this with you to give you a sense of that discourse.
It has happened again. The joy of normal life becomes a nightmare in seconds. That was the scene in Nice, France last night.
Nobody knew what to do.
He was like, I don't want to look up because he's, if I look up, he might shoot me.
Not only does the Muslim world have something in common with ISIS, it has too much in common with ISIS.
Islam
has been spread by the sword for over 1,000 years.
We know the drill. Something happens somewhere in the world by someone claiming to be Muslim and acting in the name of Islam, and suddenly each and every single Muslim is held responsible and is looking for answers. The problem is twofold. One of them is that you suddenly have to respond to all of the discrimination and have to accept collective guilt. The other one is that you now are starting to doubt your own faith. You're wondering what these texts are that extremists overseas or Islamophobes here are putting forth, and you're trying to figure out how to contextualize those texts. You and even sincere non-Muslims that are trying to find out what Islam has to say about something. Go to Google, you search for an Islamic response, and buried in all the Islamophobic papers and books and articles and videos, you find a 2.5-page da'wah pamphlet response, which is completely insufficient to get you out of that new state of doubt that you're in. Or you go to university for the first time and you take your first philosophy class, you take your first science class, and suddenly you now have questions about what your religion has to say about scientism and new atheism and things of that sort. Or you're watching a left-wing Islamophobe on TV that's putting forth this idea that Islam and modern civilization are completely incompatible. We're getting attacked from all sides as Muslims, and in many situations it renders a paralyzing doubt, and we're no longer able to define ourselves and what our religion actually means because we're allowing everybody else to define it for us. So what are we trying to do?
All right, so that was the first couple minutes of this promotional video, as I mentioned, and basically for those who weren't able to kind of either hear or follow, he's basically giving the sense in which the kind of pressures of collective guilt and the kind of hyper scrutiny of Islam in the public sphere produces this kind of paralyzing doubt, as he calls it, of, well, what does Islam really say, and that Muslims don't have ownership over kind of speaking for Islam. We're always spoken for and spoken about in the media. And so that's kind of how he's framing the source in many ways, you know, kind of the primary framing of the kind of source of this crisis of faith and doubt. And this focus on the effects of Islamophobia is a general narrative that runs through a lot of the kind of core messaging of the Institute's promotional materials. And so in a variety of promotional materials, such as, for instance, for this one, the explanation for Muslims doubting faith and leaving Islam boils down to external pressures of Islamophobia. And the kind of framing of details of this message, you know, when you read it, are mostly drawn from an article written and published on Yaqeen Institute by Omar Suleiman himself, titled Internalized Islamophobia, Exploring the Faith and Identity Crisis of American Muslim Youth. And the video summary of the article, because there's, you know, very media savvy kind of production of these infographics and of like little video summaries. So for instance, as Muslim American youth today are in a vulnerable position, rampant Islamophobia is in the media all the time. This, since I can't see it on the screen, what does it say? This has resulted in Western Muslim youth internalizing that Islamophobia. And then in the article itself that Omar Suleiman wrote, he draws on influential psychological studies on the effects of racial stereotyping and segregation on Black children in the US, as well as you know, existing studies on the effects of Islamophobia on Muslim identity. And based on this literature, he explains that internalized racism involves ingesting, often subconsciously, acceptance of the dominant society's stereotypes of one's ethnic group. Colonized mindsets and internalized racism are often subconscious, their messages primarily subliminal. And so I think the Institute and Omar Suleiman are making an important intervention and critique by highlighting the role of the external gaze through which American Muslims must constantly view themselves. As Suleiman and the other contributors to the Yaqeen Institute argue, Muslims come to understand their own religious tradition through dominant discourses in the public sphere that represent Islam as deficient, inferior, lacking, and backwards. So it is this, they argue, that is at the heart of the American Muslim crisis of faith. And so I think at one level, this is, like I said, it's an important intervention. In some ways, I think it doesn't, even at this level, it doesn't it's not that helpful for me in my my ethnographic engagements with community members and friends in the Boston area and more broadly, because for most people that I'm in conversation with, the kinds of dissonances and doubts people are experiencing are coming not through kind of perception direct necessarily most of the time from like, well, this is what people are representing as Islam in the media, but really kind of conflicts with what authoritative teachings of Islam based on texts or discourses in the community that are authorized by community leaders, those conflicting with their intuitions and sensibilities and a kind of sense of what is right. And so it's not just about accepting the claims of the Islam in the media, but I do think that they're gesturing towards something important, and there are more kind of, I would argue, sophisticated articulations of this concern and critique that focus in particular on the kinds of criteria and standards by which one judges and evaluates and values their own people or community or tradition. And that's what I want to focus on. And so the Yaqeen Institute's appeal to internalized racism and colonized mindsets alludes to the widely invoked concept of double consciousness, which is kind of this made central in the title of the talk, which was coined by the pioneering scholar, writer, activist of the early to mid 20th century, W.E.B. Du Bois. While the term double consciousness actually only appears in a single passage of his published corpus of works, it's the most widely referenced and concept and passage of Du Bois' work. So he states in this that it is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. And so Du Bois highlights the fundamental reality of a state of domination and marginalization in which Black American self-understanding has been filtered through the hegemonic gaze and standards of white supremacy. And so broadening the scope of this concept beyond its kind of particularities of the Black American experience, American Muslim scholars and public intellectuals have increasingly utilized Du Bois' articulation and notion of double consciousness along with kind of similar critiques by figures like Malcolm X. They've used that to diagnose the condition of being Muslim in the context of coloniality and Western hegemony or global Islamophobia, however it's put. And I think one of the most lucid articulations of this that I found very helpful has been Sherman Jackson, who coins the term normalized domination, using Du Bois and Charles Long to express this idea of internalizing the standards and criteria of one's oppressor. And so voices like Jackson's have utilized this framework of double consciousness to call for Muslims to develop greater critical awareness of the hegemonic discourses that pervade their consciousness. And in so doing, they argue, by being aware of and resisting normalized domination, Muslims would regain confidence in their own tradition and no longer feel compelled by the discourses that represent Islam as deficient, lacking, and backwards. And so while, again, I kind of emphasize that this is a crucial insight into the situation of Muslims as a racialized, otherized, marginalized group, my engagement with American Muslim experiences and discourse leads me to believe that it's offering only a partial and incomplete diagnosis of the condition that arises from this kind of hegemony and domination. And this is, I would say, because this framing doesn't attend to the kind of intractable dilemmas and uncertainties that arise when Muslims inevitably have to engage in interpretation, reinterpretation, assessment, reform, and critique of their own tradition. And so recall the kind of tensions and dilemmas I highlighted in the opening anecdote, which I should mention is a kind of composite of it actually happened this way, but I've kind of created a composite character based on multiple people that I've engaged with in order to kind of both anonymize and bring it to life in a way that's compelling. And I got this from my mentor, Juliana Hammer. So the tensions in the opening anecdote I mentioned raises the question of whether or not Zainab's reformist or feminist critique of Muslim traditions are the result of a colonized mindset. And what I'd like to suggest here is that this argument from double consciousness by figures like Jackson or Omar Suleiman don't remove the ambiguities and dilemmas that arise, because it doesn't clarify when such internal reinterpretations, reforms, or critiques are the result of internalized domination and when they are not. So we can actually gain a helpful insight into this by delving deeper into Du Bois and doing a closer examination of how he articulates double consciousness. And what's interesting to me is that every instance I've seen of kind of scholars talking about this in the context of Muslims exclusively refers to this idea in the quote here of looking at oneself through the eyes of others. But there is another largely neglected dimension of Du Bois' presentation that is equally essential to a full understanding of double consciousness as a condition that we exist in. And this is the idea of two-ness. So in the central passage that I referenced earlier, after defining double consciousness as the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, he then goes on to state, one ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder, in his beautiful prose as usual. In a later passage of the book, without directly naming the term double consciousness or two-ness, he kind of describes the state of being in a way that scholars have linked to the concept. So he says, from this must arrive a painful self-consciousness, an almost morbid sense of personality and a moral hesitancy which is fatal to self-confidence. And this must produce a peculiar wrenching of the soul, a peculiar sense of doubt and bewilderment. Such a double life, with double thoughts, double duties, and double social classes, must give rise to double words and double ideals, and tempt the mind to pretense or revolt, to hypocrisy or radicalism. And so while there is, of course, extensive scholarly debate about the meanings of these passages, I take them in my own context to speak powerfully to the dilemmas of internal critique and reform among dominated people. In fact, it's telling that some commentators that I've read on Du Bois have pointed out that Du Bois' argument about double consciousness seems to have been conceptualized as especially pronounced and relevant to the project of, quote, moral uplift or reform among Black leadership. And he seemed to be articulating as both a general condition, but also very specific to those people who are kind of in between worlds in that way. And double consciousness, I would say, is closely linked to the project of reform because in promoting change within one's community or tradition, the danger of internalized domination looms ever present. Advancing reform requires one to assume a position of asserting that the current conditions of one's community or tradition are deficient and must be altered. Yet how should individuals be able to determine when their assessments of such deficiency are the result of constructive self-critique or circumstances, historical circumstance, or necessary transformations and evolutions within a tradition or community, as opposed to, on the other hand, being arising from an internalized sense of inferiority that is imposed by epistemic colonization and hegemony of Euro-American modernity and white supremacy. So returning to Du Bois' passage, then, we can ask what is meant by this experience he's describing of two-ness, or doubleness. What does it mean to have two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, and two warring ideals within oneself? What does it mean, and maybe the self as both an individual and in a community? And what does it mean to lead a double life constituted by double thoughts, double words, and double ideals? And that's what I was kind of grappling with and engaging in relation to the kind of ethnographic work I've done. And I think Du Bois here is gesturing towards the experience of being torn between deeply conflicting aspirations and commitments and convictions, an experience that inevitably arises from the condition of domination. On the one hand, virtually all my Muslim interlocutors have expressed genuine concerns with authentically upholding and preserving the integrity of their own community and tradition and God's revealed message, and feel compelled to kind of resist, consciously being dominated and colonized in these ways that I've described. That's a kind of concern that people talk about, that comes up, that it figures into how conversations and debates happen. But at the same time, almost everybody also expresses deep convictions at various points that there are some real issues or real problems within their tradition or within their community that need resolution. Certain reformist critiques or concerns aren't always, simply seen as the product of the external gaze, but are valid and important in and of themselves as a response to lived realities, internal developments within their tradition that must be concerned and that must be kind of reconciled and addressed. And so in this reading, I think Du Bois' two unreconciled strivings and two warring ideals represents the imperative of internal reform on the one hand, and the imperative of resisting external hegemony and preserving tradition on the other hand. And within such a situation, one, maybe can never know which of these conflicting directions to move in, or can never settle on a particular stance, but is always pulled in these opposing directions. Or to put it perhaps another way, who and how can determine when the need for reform is a result of this kind of domination and when it's due to other kinds of circumstances and imperatives. And these claims are precisely very deeply contested and lead to further uncertainty and ambivalence. And so people like the Zainab, the character of Zainab that I have spoken of at the very beginning, while in situations like this might be accused of kind of adopting an Orientalist lens or internalizing certain kinds of racist tropes, etc. In other contexts, they also kind of make those distinctions between what counts as legitimate critique and what simply perpetuates racist, imperialist othering. And so they kind of recognize that at times when Muslims are making certain kinds of critiques of other Muslims or their tradition, that it's uncomfortably tied in with imperialism or racism and Islamophobia. But in other ways, so such people are clearly aware of the challenge and danger of internalized Islamophobia, but at the same time confidently reject the notion that their concerns and critiques about gendered norms in Islamic tradition, in this case, can be reduced to normalized domination or internalized racism. And on the flip side of this kind of confident assertion that that one's kind of reformist critique is not emerging from that kind of racism is the confidence of those quote unquote defending tradition, like the young woman in the opening anecdote. So for such individuals, who are also a significant kind of group within my ethnographic interlocutors, the awareness of hegemonic domination of Muslims by Western modernity, or however one wants to put it, makes them quite confident in a given case that their dismissal and critique of some kind of reformist approach or voice or voices of internal dissent, that these are kind of not serious, that these are kind of external, due to a kind of external influence or domination. But these same people, of course, would be in many ways open to reinterpretations and reformist kind of ideas in other cases, or might have certain kind of revisionist understandings of Islam, but reject that this is a kind of state of being compromised by kind of colonization of the mind. So there's a kind of the way in which that confidence kind of plays out in different ways. But in contrast to that kind of self-confidence in navigating these ambiguities, other ethnographic interlocutors of mine were much more hesitant and insecure as a result of this double consciousness, which kind of mirrors some of Du Bois' characterization. And they kind of constantly vacillated between conflicting stances. So one individual might, would often be kind of deeply troubled by orthodox, quote unquote, understandings of gender in Islam, and open to the idea of kind of reformist reinterpretations. And on the other hand, the same individuals regularly felt the need to justify and kind of assent to whatever the community deemed authentically Islamic and orthodox, even if it violated, some sensibilities or values that they held, because they insisted we can't allow modern Western sensibilities to be imposed on Islam. So the same individual would go back and forth on the same issue, and specifically kind of talking about that kind of concern. And so while we see the different ways in which individuals navigate these kind of dilemmas of double consciousness that I'm trying to point out, across the board, what we see, what's clear is that simply the awareness of double consciousness or internalized domination in and of itself doesn't resolve the doubts, dilemmas, and ambiguities and dissonances that people experience in their belonging to tradition, since it remains deeply tenuous and ambiguous where the boundary lies between the need for internal reform and critique on the one hand, and the pressure to live up to the internalized criteria of one's oppressor on the other hand. This impossibility of knowing where the line is between self-critique and internalized domination leads to, quote, hesitancy, which is fatal to self-confidence, a peculiar wrenching of the soul, and a peculiar sense of doubt and bewilderment. And again, I think, just as a side comment, I think I would see that as both Du Bois describing something that is within an individual subjectivity as well as within a communal sense. But so I'd like to conclude my talk by bringing in a poignant representation of these dilemmas and tensions found in two deeply conflicting sentiments, both expressed by the celebrated reformer and philosopher-poet of colonial India, Muhammad Iqbal. And I just as a note, I kind of came across these two passages juxtaposed in this way in a short piece by Ibrahim Musa, where he mentions both statements, and it really kind of struck me and stood out to me as an important expression of what I'm trying to get at. So in the first is the Muhammad Iqbal that, well, that didn't come out as I thought. The Muhammad Iqbal that most people are familiar with as a kind of modernist reformer, saying that the task before the modern Muslim is immense. He has to rethink the whole system of Islam without completely breaking with the past. The only course open to us is to approach modern knowledge with a respectful but independent attitude, and to appreciate the teachings of Islam in the light of that knowledge, even though we may like to differ from those who have gone before us. So kind of a complete, rethinking of the whole system, but not breaking with the past. So he's already kind of trying to balance that, but it's kind of a radical statement in his reconstruction of religious thought of that imperative. But elsewhere, of course, Iqbal is deeply aware and concerned about epistemic colonization. And so, for instance, in a poem, he says, "I fear this cry for modernism is only a ruse to make the East imitate the Franks," which is often used as a way of referring to the West or Europe. And so to me, this kind of juxtaposition represents the importance of being able to hold these two conflicting orientations together, and to recognize that reform and critique are deeply fraught when there is such hegemonic domination, and produce lots of insecurities and anxieties and tensions, but also kind of a caution not to simply reduce everything to that kind of those power relations. And so this ability to kind of hold these two things together has been talked about, for instance, as, quote, the double bind between Islamophobia and gender injustice. An article by Rochelle Turman very powerfully articulates, but other scholars have addressed as well. Or, for instance, the importance of double critique and the ambiguities of making determinations of, when something is Islamophobic and when it's a feminist critique, for instance, which Juliana Hammer has talked about. But what I'm trying to suggest and add to this conversation and these important interventions is kind of the importance and centrality of uncertainty and ambivalence and insecurity, and how they are so tied in with this condition of domination. And especially because of the fact that one can't simply escape it, is kind of one of the fundamental things I'm trying to convey. Whether it's those advocating reform or defending tradition as these two kind of binaries that obviously, it's more complicated, but regardless of the fact, one must recognize that you can't simply refuse the condition of domination and double consciousness. It's a reality, anxiety, and concern that pervades all conversations about reform, change, tradition, authenticity, etc., regardless of the stance that is taken. And to fully acknowledge this is, I believe, to embrace the importance of uncertainty and ambiguity. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to your questions and thoughts and comments.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Zaid. I guess if you were in the room, you would get an applause. So imagine that for us, please. Okay, thank you. Wonderful. And thank you again for this rich presentation. I think as we close out, again, a few reminders. We've just posted the link to sign up for the emails. Please watch the Center and the Maydan web spaces for the recording, which we'll hope to release in about a week's time. The link to Zaid's earlier article in Maydan gives a few vignettes from his research was very helpful for me in trying to think around these issues. So Zaid, thank you so much once again for joining us. Thank you to all of you for joining us on virtual platform. We hope that your end of semester goes smoothly and that you all stay safe and well. Again, thank you to all of you.
Thank you.